They called my name, and the whole auditorium stood up. I didn't turn to look at my parents. I already knew what I'd see. Two pale faces frozen in a sea of applause they never expected. All those years, I thought I wanted them to clap, to finally see me, to say they were proud. But standing on that stage with the spotlight on me, not my sister, not the daughter they invested in, I realized something. This wasn't their moment. It was mine. And I didn't need their approval to feel it. I just needed to remember every single time they told me I wasn't worth the effort. And still, I showed up. I earned this, without them. I was 8 the first time I noticed it. Not the absence of love, but the quiet way it skipped over me. My sister had just won some spelling bee. Nothing big, just one of those regional things where kids stand on stage and spell out words like chrysanthemum with nervous hands. My mom brought balloons. My dad took the day off work. After the event, they took us out to dinner at that Italian place downtown, the one with the white tablecloths and oil-dipped bread. They let her order soda. I asked for the same. My mom said, "Not tonight, honey. You didn't win anything." And that was it. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. It just landed, like a small crack in glass. That night in the car, I pressed my face against the cold window, pretended to sleep, listened as they told her how proud they were. She talked about college like she already belonged there. No one asked me what I wanted to be, and I didn't say, because by then I'd already learned. Silence made things easier. It wasn't just one moment, it was a rhythm. Her piano recitals got flowers. My school play got a rushed photo and a "we're proud of you too, sweetie." She got tutoring. I got handed a workbook. She got a summer camp. I got told, "We'll see." When she was stressed, they'd check in. When I was quiet, they let me stay that way. Even birthdays had different tones. Hers were events. Decorations, cake themes, matching napkins. Mine felt like an afterthought, like they remembered just in time. One year, I saved up for weeks to buy my mom a necklace from the farmer's market. It was nothing fancy, just a small chain with a glass pendant, blue like the sea. She smiled when I gave it to her, said thank you, set it aside. 2 weeks later, it was still in the same paper bag, under some magazines. But when my sister made her a necklace out of dried pasta and yarn, she wore it to brunch, smiled like it was Cartier. Looking back now, it's not the big betrayals that cut deepest. It's the ones you can't prove, the ones that look like ordinary life from the outside. We were a good family. We had dinner together. We went to church. We weren't broken. But somehow, I was breaking. There was a teacher once, Mrs. Carter, 5th grade. She noticed I never volunteered. Asked me one day after class why I stayed so quiet. I told her I didn't have much to say. She looked at me for a long time, then said, "That's not true. I think you've just been taught not to speak." She let me help organize the class poetry wall, gave me a notebook at the end of the year. Inside the front cover, she wrote, "Some voices don't need to shout, but that doesn't mean they should be ignored." I kept that notebook hidden in my nightstand for years. Wrote in it when things felt too heavy, mostly questions, mostly things I knew I'd never ask out loud. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if someone had noticed earlier. If someone in that house had stopped long enough to ask why I kept getting quieter. But they didn't, because I didn't cause trouble. Because I smiled when I was supposed to. Because I didn't complain. And in families like mine, that's what gets rewarded. Not honesty, not pain, just obedience. One day, years later, I'd hear my mom say to a friend, "She's always been the easy one." And I remember thinking, that's not love. That's convenience. Middle school felt like learning to disappear, not all at once. More like a gradual dissolving. Every time I raised my hand and wasn't called on. Every time I brought home a decent grade and it got a quick, "that's good," while my sister's bees got celebratory cupcakes. By the time I turned 14, I had stopped expecting attention. Not out of anger, just realism. I kept my head down. I studied hard. I packed my own lunch, and I started working, quiet, small jobs after school. Babysitting, shelving books at the library, helping a neighbor organize her garage for a few bucks. No one asked where I went after class. I doubt they even noticed I wasn't home. There was this coffee shop near campus. Dim lighting, mismatched furniture, always smelled like cinnamon and burnt espresso. I'd sit in the back after work, finishing homework, just me and my chipped laptop. a playlist of soft piano music, and sometimes silence. There's a particular kind of silence you make peace with. Not comforting, not lonely, just neutral. Like the absence of interruption becomes its own kind of safety. Once, sophomore year, I came home late, shivering from the walk back, my shoes soaked, my coat torn at the sleeve from catching on a fence. I opened the door, dripping on the tile. My mom looked up from the couch. She didn't ask where I'd been, didn't say I looked cold, just asked if I could be quieter. That night I stood in the kitchen holding a chipped mug I'd microwaved with cheap tea. My thumb traced the crack over and over. It wasn't anger I felt, or sadness, just something like a quiet click, like a lock turning in my own chest. I started keeping things from them after that. Small things at first, test scores, a compliment from a teacher, a paper published in the school journal. Later, bigger things. My acceptance into a summer mentorship, a letter from a community foundation, offering a scholarship for students facing adversity. I folded that letter neatly, placed it in my notebook, didn't say a word, because what was the point? Sometimes in family group texts, my name wouldn't even be mentioned. My sister's new internships, her friends, her busy schedule would take up paragraphs. If I sent a message, it got one emoji, a thumbs up. That was it. Junior year, I got a part-time job at a campus wellness center. Minimum wage, but it felt like something real. I helped set up mindfulness rooms, arranged yoga mats, cleaned therapy spaces. One of the counselors told me I had a calm presence. That night, I wrote that phrase down. Calm presence. It felt like the first label that didn't make me small. A professor once paused during class to read a paragraph I'd written aloud. He looked up at me after and said, "Keep going. That's a voice that needs to be heard." I smiled. But I didn't tell anyone when I got home. I didn't need to, because something was shifting inside me, like a beam quietly being set into place beneath a cracked ceiling. I was starting to build something. Not loud, not rushed, but mine. Emotional breath. I remember peeling an orange in my dorm one night, just sitting on my bed, lights off, pulling away each bit of rind slowly. The room smelled like citrus and cheap carpet cleaner, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I just felt steady. And still, at Thanksgiving, my mother asked me, "So, are you just working part-time, or what's your plan?" I said, "It's going fine." She nodded. Moved on to my sister's new boyfriend. I sipped water. Tasted nothing. What they didn't know, what they never asked, was that I'd already paid for most of my tuition, that I'd won 3 scholarships they'd never heard about, that I'd built something while they weren't looking. They thought I was quiet because I had nothing to say. But really, I was just done explaining myself to people who never listened. It started with a paper, just a routine assignment in my social policy class. We were supposed to analyze how public funding affected access to mental health services in low-income communities. Most students quoted journals. I wrote about my job at the campus wellness center, the woman who came in every Thursday and sat in the mindfulness room for exactly 12 minutes. Never spoke, just sat, breathing like someone who'd been holding it for years. I titled it, 12 Minutes of Silence. I turned it in and forgot about it. 2 weeks later, Professor Reyes stopped me after class. He said, "Your essay? It stayed with me." He paused. "Have you ever thought about publishing something?" I didn't know what to say. No one had ever asked if I had something worth saying. That night, I reread what I'd written. Not for grammar, not to edit, just to see if it was really mine. And it was. Every word. A few months later, that same essay was published in the university's undergrad policy journal. It wasn't national, it didn't go viral, but in our hallway, it was taped to a bulletin board with a sticky note. "Read this? It's different." And people did. I started getting questions in class. Peers I barely knew asked if I wanted to grab coffee. One of them, Jess, started walking with me after lectures. "I love how you write," she said one day. "It's like you don't try to sound smart, you just sound real." I laughed. That was the first time someone used my real voice as a compliment. My job at the wellness center changed too. The counselor started asking if I'd help lead the orientation for new volunteers. I made quiet adjustments to the scheduling system, created a new intake checklist for first-time clients. One day, the center director called me into her office. She said, "You're not just organized, you care. It's rare." She handed me a small envelope, a scholarship, funded by a retired alum who'd once used the center herself. She'd left a note, "For someone who knows the power of quiet help." I held the envelope for a long time before opening it. I didn't tell my parents, not because I was hiding it, because I didn't want to hear that flat, distracted tone again. The one that said, "Oh, that's nice," without really meaning it. It's wild how we can crave approval for so long, until we finally outgrow the hunger. One Saturday, I was at the dining hall with Jess and a few others from class. We were talking about internships in grad school. "Normal stuff," Jess asked. "Do your parents know how much you've done?" I shrugged, poked at my food. She tilted her head, didn't press. Just said, "Well, I hope they get it someday." There was no bitterness in her voice, just quiet loyalty. That kind of support, it sneaks up on you. Emotional breath. That night, I refilled the humidifier in my dorm, watched the steam curl against the lamplight. I opened the window, cold air touched my skin. I wasn't anyone big, I wasn't viral, but for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. By people who didn't owe it to me, by people who chose to notice. What hurt most wasn't that my family didn't know. It was that if I told them, they still might not care. They'd ask if I was eating well, maybe mention my sister's new role at her firm, then go back to whatever they were doing, because they didn't mean harm. That's the part that confused me the most. They weren't cruel. They were just fixed on someone else's light, but even shadows can grow strong when no one's watching. And mine? It had shape now. It had voice. And even if my parents weren't listening, the world was starting to. It came in an envelope so plain I almost threw it out. No fancy logo, no gold seal, just my name in black ink and an address I didn't recognize. I opened it standing by the mailboxes in my dorm. People passed me, laughing, heading to class, earbuds in. No one noticed. Inside, a letter from the National Wellness and Equity Foundation. I'd been awarded a full-ride scholarship for my senior year. I read it twice. Then, a third time. Not because I didn't believe it, but because for once I didn't feel surprised. I knew I'd earned it. I didn't tell my parents. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. There was no announcement, no shared group text, no phone call saying, "Well, guess what?" Just silence. Not the kind that aches, the kind that protects. A week later, I sat across from Jess at the campus cafe. She was venting about her ex and the internship she hated. I smiled, nodded, stirred my tea. Then she said, "You're always so calm, like nothing ever touches you." I looked at her, thought about all the times I cried into my pillow with a sweatshirt in my mouth so no one would hear, the shifts I picked up on weekends, the nights I walked back alone in the cold because my family wouldn't send gas money. Then I said, "I just got lucky, I guess." She didn't know what to say, and honestly, neither did I. Because what do you say when luck had nothing to do with it? Emotional breath. That night, I lit a dollar store candle in my dorm. Vanilla-scented, slightly crooked wick. I sat on the edge of my bed, letter in hand, and whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. To myself, maybe. The scholarship wasn't just money, it was proof. That I could stand on my own. That someone read what I wrote, saw what I did, and thought it mattered. Even if my parents didn't. The same week the scholarship came through, my mom sent a photo of my sister at a gala. Some corporate event, hair curled, makeup perfect, champagne in hand. "Doesn't she look grown up?" she texted. I didn't reply. 2 days later, she followed up. "Everything okay on your end?" I typed, "Yep, all good," and left it at that. I used to think not sharing was the same as hiding, that keeping things from family meant something was wrong. But now I know some things you keep for yourself because they're too precious to waste on people who never looked for them in the first place. One night, Professor Reyes stopped me after class again. "I heard about the scholarship," he said. His voice was warm but careful. "Your family must be proud." I smiled and said, "They don't know." He blinked, didn't press, just nodded, and said, "Well, I am." That was enough. The day the funds hit my student account, I walked to campus with my headphones in and a kind of quiet power in my chest. Not anger, not pride, just sovereignty. That's the word that came to mind, mine. This was mine, not given, not gifted, not granted out of pity, earned, in full. If they had asked, I might have told them, but they didn't. They were too busy sending me photos of my sister's new car, too busy asking if I'd be coming home for the holidays, even though they knew I'd have to work. They didn't know what they missed. And I wasn't about to explain, because silence, when chosen, can be a form of freedom. They emailed me on a Thursday. Subject line, "Congratulations, valedictorian." At first, I thought it was a mistake. I even checked the name twice, but there it was. Mine. No fanfare, no caps lock, just an official line at the bottom. You will be expected to give a short speech at commencement. I stared at the screen, then closed the tab. Didn't tell anyone. Not even Jess. I didn't write a speech, didn't rehearse in the mirror or pace my dorm, mouthing lines to invisible applause. What could I possibly say that would explain any of it? That I got here with no one clapping? That I walked this whole road alone? No. There was nothing to practice, because I already knew what I needed to say, and, more importantly, what I didn't. 2 days before graduation, my mom texted, "Do we need tickets or anything?" That was it. No congrats. No, we're proud of you. Just logistics. I replied, "Nope, just show up." They said they'd drive in that morning. No offer to help with my robe. No dinner plans. Just show up. Graduation morning, I ironed my gown on a towel spread across the desk. The steam rose in soft curls, and for a moment I watched it like it was the only thing moving in the world. I thought about that chipped mug, that scholarship envelope, that orange I peeled in silence. I thought about how many things I'd carried with no one noticing the weight. And then I smiled, because now the weight was gone. When they called my name, I walked up the stairs slow, not with hesitation, but with certainty. The lights were hot. The mic smelled like metal and dust. I looked out at a sea of faces. Most were strangers, but in the second row, third seat from the left, I saw my father adjust his tie like he was suddenly too warm. My mother looked confused, like she hadn't expected me to be this visible. I began simply, "Some of us arrived here with cheering sections, parents with signs, family shouting from the bleachers, and some of us got here in silence." A pause. Some of us studied between shifts, applied for scholarships we didn't mention, learned how to believe in ourselves because nobody else did it for us. A longer pause. To those of you who walked alone, this one's for you. There was no anger in my voice, no bitterness, just truth. And maybe that's why it hit so hard. A few rows up, I saw Jess lean forward, her hand over her heart, eyes wide, glistening. My parents didn't clap, not during the speech, not after. Just sat there, frozen. Later, someone told me they cried. Not because the speech was sad, but because it felt earned. One line, that's all it took. We learned how to believe in ourselves because nobody else did it for us. After the ceremony, people came up to hug me, shake my hand, ask what I planned to do next. I smiled, said thank you, took pictures. But I never walked over to my parents, and they never walked to me. Emotional breath. Back in my room, I took off my cap, set it on the windowsill, and watched it catch the last light of the afternoon. The tassel moved just slightly in the breeze from the cracked pane. Quiet, still, complete. That night, Jess texted me. Do they know what that speech really meant? I typed and erased a dozen replies. Finally, I sent, "They were there." That was all. Because I didn't need them to get it. I didn't need them to change. I didn't need them to say sorry. The silence between us used to feel like punishment. Now, it was peace. The applause was still echoing when I stepped off the stage. People were clapping, cheering. Someone in the back actually whistled. Jess was the first to reach me, her arms tight around my shoulders, eyes red from crying. "You killed it," she whispered. I hope they heard every word. I didn't have to ask who they were. A professor offered a handshake. The dean gave me a quiet nod. Even the event photographer asked for an extra shot. That speech, he said, it meant something. And in the middle of all that motion, the hugs, the flashes, the laughter, I turned my head and saw them. Second row, still seated. My father was adjusting his watch. My mother was scrolling through her phone. Neither of them moved, They didn't come over, didn't say well done, didn't ask for a photo, didn't offer a ride home. They just stayed seated, waiting for it to be over, waiting to leave. It's strange. You picture that moment for years. Imagine it a dozen ways. They'd cry, apologize, finally say what they never did. But the real thing? It was quiet, uneventful, the opposite of dramatic, and somehow that made it worse. They didn't argue, they didn't lash out. They just watched everyone else celebrate me like it was happening to someone they barely knew. And in that silence, I understood something cold and final. Emotional breath. After the crowd thinned, I found a bench near the student center, sat down, picked at the strap of my sandal, felt the indent it left across my foot, rubbed it with my thumb. I don't know why I noticed that. Maybe because it was the only thing that felt real right then. A girl I didn't know well from my economics class walked by. She stopped. "Hey, you were amazing up there." I smiled, said thank you. She hesitated. "Your parents didn't stand when they announced you. I saw them." I looked up, met her eyes. "It's okay," I said. "They've had a long time to get used to not clapping." Back at my dorm, I changed out of the gown, folded it slowly like it was made of silk, laid it on the bed, sat down beside it, and let the quiet fill the room. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't painful. It was something else, like standing in a doorway and realizing you're already on the other side. That night, my mom texted, "We're heading out. Traffic's bad. Great seeing you." No congrats, no call, just that. I didn't respond, didn't delete it either, just let it sit there like a voicemail from a number I don't plan to call back. People talk about closure like it's a conversation, a hug, a big cathartic moment. But sometimes it's the exact opposite. Sometimes closure is when the final thing you hoped for doesn't happen, and you realize you're still standing. They left campus without saying goodbye. I watched from the dining hall window as their car pulled out. My dad never looked back. I don't hate them. That's the thing. Hate would be easier, cleaner. What I feel is quieter, more settled, like a door that shut itself without a sound. The reception wasn't fancy, just a folding table with finger foods, a punch bowl that tasted like watered-down cranberry, and a dozen metal chairs set in a half circle in the faculty lounge. Someone had printed my name on cardstock. Black ink, all caps, no frills. But when I walked in, people stood. Not all at once, but slowly. Soft applause, genuine smiles, nods that meant something. Professor Reyes motioned for me to come up front. I hadn't expected a speech. He started talking about resilience, about how it's not always loud, not always visible, how sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never ask for attention. Just keep showing up. He looked at me when he said that, and in that moment I felt something shift. Not pride, not vindication. Something quieter, like finally being named in a story where I'd always been background. Then he said it. Starting this fall, the Isabel Cooper Resilience Award will be given annually to a student who demonstrates exceptional perseverance in the face of quiet adversity. My name, on a scholarship, funded by an anonymous donor who had read my published essay, the one about the woman in the mindfulness room, 12 minutes of silence. I stood there clutching the edge of a paper plate and blinked. Because what do you do when the thing you fought for in secret gets turned into a public declaration? You stand still and let it land. People clapped again. Jess was crying. Even the dean smiled like he'd known me all along. And in the corner, near the door, my parents stood stiff. My mother's purse was clutched close to her chest. My father kept his hands in his pockets. They didn't clap, but they were there. They heard every word. I didn't look at them when I sat back down. Didn't search their faces for recognition. That hunger had left me. Emotional breath. After the reception, I walked through the quad alone. My shoes clicked against the bricks, sunlight flickering through the leaves. I stopped at the fountain and watched a bird dip its wings in the water. No one was watching. And for once, that made it better. Back in my dorm, I took the program from the reception, folded it in half, and tucked it between the pages of my notebook. The same notebook from 5th grade, the one Mrs. Carter gave me. "Some voices don't need to shout," she wrote. I smiled. That night, my sister posted photos from her latest conference. New blazer, new contacts, new caption, "Don't wait for anyone to hand you a seat. Build your own table." Funny, I'd never even been offered a chair. But here I was, building scholarships. My mom didn't message me. "No, we're proud of you." No, that was a surprise. Just silence. And it didn't sting this time, because silence from them wasn't emptiness anymore. It was proof that I no longer needed the noise. I didn't tell anyone about the nameplate they gave me after the reception. I keep it in my drawer. Wood base, brass plaque etched with Isabel Cooper, Resilience Award. Sometimes, when I feel like I'm fading again, I take it out, hold it for a second, then put it back. Not because I forget who I am, but because I remember. They didn't hug me when they left, just nodded. My father said for him, "Safe travels?" I said, "You too." That was it. No closure, no warmth, just two people standing at opposite ends of the same story they never bothered to read. It started with a blank document, no title, no greeting, just the slow blink of a cursor. I sat there, elbows on the kitchen table of my new apartment, still in my onboarding t-shirt from work, fingers hovering over the keys, and I wrote, "Dear Mom and Dad." Then I stopped. The words came fast after that. Not poetic, not edited, just real. About the nights I cried after they forgot my birthday. About walking home in the rain because no one would Venmo me $20 for gas. About the scholarship letter I celebrated alone with instant noodles and the sound of someone else's music bleeding through the dorm walls. I told them I used to think there was something wrong with me, that if I were smarter, louder, more like her, they'd love me the way I needed. I told them about 5th grade, the chipped mug, the pizza party they never showed up to. I told them about the silence and how it used to feel like drowning. And then, at the end, I wrote, "But I'm not angry anymore. I just wanted you to know what you missed." I stared at it, read it twice, 3 times, and then I closed the laptop. Didn't save, didn't print, just closed it. Because I realized something. That letter wasn't for them. It never was. A week later, I got my first paycheck. Direct deposit. Line item, Public Health Associate, Regional Equity Division. I opened the scanned copy of my degree, typed in my parents' address, attached the file, added one more thing, a check. Not much, just a symbolic amount. Enough to say, "I'm okay, even if you never helped me get here." No message, no signature, just silence, emotional breath. After I clicked send, I stood up, walked to the sink, and rinsed out a glass that had been sitting there all morning. Watched the water swirl down the drain, held the glass for a few seconds longer than necessary, let it drip. That's what the moment felt like. Not dramatic, not righteous, just clean. They never responded. No text, no email, no call. And strangely, that made it easier, because silence from them used to feel like abandonment. Now, it felt like closure. Jess asked me once, "If they apologize tomorrow, what would you say?" I thought about it, and then I said, "Nothing." She blinked. "You wouldn't want that moment?" "I used to," I told her, "but now I want peace more than I want proof." We all want the apology, the scene, the tearful reckoning. But sometimes the real win is not needing it anymore. What I sent that day wasn't just a check. It was the final act in a play they never watched. And I didn't send it to hurt them. I sent it to stop hurting myself. Because I don't need to be understood by people who never tried. I don't need to be heard by voices that were never listening. And I don't need a reply to know I've arrived. I moved out of my dorm on a Tuesday, no fanfare. Just cardboard boxes, a vacuum that didn't quite work, and the faint smell of leftover ramen in the hallway. Jess came to help. We didn't say much, just carried one box at a time down 3 flights of stairs in the heat. She hugged me at the curb, held on a little longer than usual, then whispered, "You did it?" And I did. My new apartment was small, bright, a little noisy, traffic all night, but I didn't mind. It was mine. There was something about placing my chipped mug in its own cabinet that felt ceremonial, like claiming space in a life I'd built with my own hands. The job started 2 weeks later. Public health, community wellness outreach. My badge read, equity coordinator. It still makes me laugh a little. Not out of disbelief, but because it fits. Every day, I work with people who never got the benefit of being seen. People who've been told their whole lives they're less than. Too hard to help? Not worth the effort. And every day, I show up with the quiet certainty that they are, because I know what it feels like to need someone who never comes. A few weeks into the job, I passed a mirror in the hallway. Stopped. Looked at myself. Not to fix anything. Not to judge. Just looked. And for the first time, I didn't see the girl they forgot to clap for. I didn't see the backup daughter. I saw someone whole. Emotional breath. On Sundays, I walk to the corner cafe and sit by the window with a cinnamon latte. The same one every time. I bring a book I barely read. Let the light fall across the table. Watch people walk by with dogs, strollers, coffee in hand. Sometimes I think, this is it. Not a climax. Not a crescendo. Just peace. Slow, earned, steady peace. My parents haven't called. It's been 3 months. There's a part of me that still flinches at the silence, like muscle memory. But most days, it's just background noise. Like the hum of a fridge. You stop noticing. They sent a card. Late, generic. Congrats on the job. Proud of you. It wasn't signed. No message inside. I placed it in a drawer. Not out of spite, just out of choice. Because not every thread needs to stay knotted. Some things unravel, and that's okay. Jess came to visit last weekend. We sat on the floor with takeout and old stories. At one point, she said, "Do you ever wish it had ended differently?" I paused, took a sip of warm soda, then said, "No, I just wish it had started better." Because the goodbye already happened. Not in words, not in some dramatic exit, but slowly, over years. In missed birthdays, unanswered texts, silences where love should have lived. Some goodbyes don't sound like doors slamming. They sound like nothing at all. And that's okay. Because I'm not waiting anymore. Not circling the same grief, hoping it gives me something new. I'm walking forward. Toward a life with color, soft mornings, and people who see me fully without needing a reason. I don't need to prove anything. Not to them, not to anyone. I'm enough. Right now, just like this. If you've ever been the one they overlooked, the one they forgot to cheer for, I hope you know your value isn't waiting in someone else's hands. You carry it, even in silence, especially in silence. The last thing I packed from my dorm was the notebook, the one Mrs. Carter gave me, still had the sticky corners and folded pages. I slipped it into my bag, didn't open it, didn't need to. Because that voice inside me, it's not hidden anymore.